Hello, everybody, and welcome to this next session with Mark Schreiner, privacy, security, data protection, and a lot of more beautiful things. So let me shortly introduce Mark. Mark Schreiner is the Strategic Sales Director for memoQ. Previously, Mark has held leadership roles in the localization industry, including CEO Asia Pacific for CLS Communication and Managing Director Asia for the Big World. So Mark earned the Cybersecurity Managing Risk in the Information Age from Harvard and is the host of the Security Talk podcast. So, just a fun fact, Mark will be racing an 80-kilometer mountain bike race this Saturday at Prescott. So, go for it, Mark. Okay, Mark, the stage is yours. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Marcus. And I'm in the process of sharing my screen. Hopefully, you can see it right now. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for sharing the fun fact. It's probably convinced anybody who's listening that I have a screw loose. The mountain bike race seemed like a good idea at the time, and now that it's 4 days away, I'm getting a little nervous. I do have to say something. This is totally unscripted, but it just kind of came to me this morning. I'm at GALA in San Diego, and for those of you that couldn't make it here, I just have to say it's really nice to get back and meet people in our industry in a face-to-face environment. I appreciate you logging in virtually and doing this, but I'm just reminded that we have this amazing industry. People are, I think, really share common interests of language, travel, culture, food, and of course, localization. And so I'm just saying, I feel an immense sense of gratitude for being here, and appreciate you all for logging in. Now, that's not what I'm here to talk about. What I am here to talk about, as Marcus said, is privacy, security, data protection, and workflow automation, blah, blah, blah. You've seen the title. I should get an award for the longest presentation title. I'm not going to go through it all because actually this topic is something that we could spend a day or two on easily. But what we're going to do today, and somebody, how do I advance I go here, there we go to the next slide. What we're going to do is just take a very, very high level look at some regulatory and compliance strategies, some data protection best practices, IT security best practices, which is different from data security. Data security is just protecting your data, of course. IT is your general infrastructure or your technology that you're developing, etc. And then if we have time, we'll get into some workflow automation trends. We're going to try to talk about all this in the context of regulated industries, so financial services and healthcare. But a lot of these principles apply to basically most companies or organizations, regardless of your industry. Okay, before we jump in, I want to talk about why is this important. I think everybody knows that, your device could get hacked, and people say like, okay, so I can't use my device. Excuse me, I take a drink of water. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal is if you're subject to a ransomware attack, for example, and your data is locked up in your CRM or your financial records or your messaging systems, you cannot do business. So that's operational risk. And I think most people, yeah, I get that. There's also reputational risk. So if you are an LSP, or if you are a contract research organization or a financial services provider, and you have a data breach, nobody's going to trust you. And somebody actually said yesterday that for an LSP to expand their business, the most important thing is trust, right? And so if your reputation takes a hit, it's going to be hard for you to grow your business. In fact, Target was had a data breach about 2.5, 3 years ago. Their sales dropped over 46%, and most of that was attributed to their reputational hit that they took because of that breach. So it's important. So you got operational, reputational. There's also legal and compliance risk. So yes, you can be sued, or you can be assessed fines from different regulatory bodies. GDPR, for example, has assessed fines in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, we're going to talk about how to kind of mitigate that a bit, but the first step in prevention and mitigation is being aware of what are the risks and why are we doing this, okay? I keep forgetting I have to hit the button down here to go to the next slide. Okay, so the regulatory landscape. This, by the way, this slide here is a massive simplification. And this is what makes it challenging. If you look kind of to the upper left, you can see that we have, well, in the US, we have state regulatory bodies. So for example, California has the CCPA, California Consumer Privacy Act. But we also have, there are, national regulations. China has its HIPAA. Singapore is regulated under the Monetary Authority of Singapore. The UK, Canada, every country, Brazil, has its own regulatory body that protects consumer privacy. In addition to that, if you look to the right, you have industry specific. So we're talking about healthcare and financial services. You have, in the US, you have HIPAA for healthcare providers. You also have for PCI, which is the payment card industry regulatory regulations. In Canada, you have HIPAA or FIPA. That was a joke. It's not PHIPAA, it's HIPAA. But so you have to like figure out and map, if you're doing business in multiple countries with customers around the world, you have to figure out which regulatory body do we need to adhere to. Now, the good news is that nobody says you have to do them all. You need to kind of pick and establish a baseline. And when it comes to IT security, the ones that, in data security, the ones that you need to look at most closely are the ones at the bottom: ISO 27001, CIS, SOC 2, and NIST. And for memoQ, my company, or the company I work with, we are increasingly being asked what certifications that we have, both as part of customer conversations, but also as RFPs. A lot of large organizations and governments must send their new business opportunities out to RFP. And the question about, do you have ISO 27001 in case of memoQ? Yes, we do. Do you have CIS, SOC 2, NIST, etc.? And you need to be able to respond accordingly. Okay, now it's not always a game stopper, but it's becoming increasingly important, especially if you're working with companies in the regulated spaces, healthcare, financial services. So what's our recommendation? Well, I'm not going to give you my recommendation. I'm going to let you receive recommendations from a couple of industry experts. Hiram Machado, formerly of Bound Global, Lionbridge, founder of AdeQuest, which at one point had about 200 localization project managers working on site at Microsoft, is now a Microsoft Gold partner for cybersecurity and compliance. And Hiram advises and works with companies all across North America and South America, including several companies in the localization industry. He says, while there's a fair amount of overlap in NIST, CIS, ISO 27001, SOC 2, the most important thing is not to try to do them all. Pick one that you want to work with, or figure out what your customers want and pursue that. Another kind of industry insider, Dieter Rung, at co-founder and at Boostlingo, he says, for their business, because they're providing over the phone interpretation a lot of times to healthcare providers, HIPAA is 100% compliant, the Bible for us when it comes to compliance. So again, neither one is saying we got to map and do all of these. Let's figure out the ones that are most relevant. When you do that, though, keep in mind that almost all of those regulations and those compliance organizations, they overlap and have some shared general principles. And if you understand those principles, it will better help you to kind of prepare and improve your compliance posture. Okay, excuse me, another drink of water. So some of the key concepts are, you have a data owner, controller, and a processor, and you need to know who you are in that feed chain, because depending on who you are, you will have different levels of rights and responsibilities. Responsibilities very heavily shifted on the controller and processor. So as an example, I work for a company, memoQ. They have my personal data, but I'm the owner of that data. They are the controller of the data in terms of how they're using it. And if memoQ were to outsource, like say it's payroll to ADP or another payroll company, the outsourced organization, they would be the processor. In a real world example that in our industry, contract research organization maybe send some patient-related outcomes text. Maybe so the patient is actually the owner. The contracted CRO is the controller. They send that to an LSP for translation. The LSP would then be the processor. And again, depending on where you're at in that food chain, you have certain rights, primarily for the data owner, but large responsibilities with the controller and the processor. One of the responsibilities that almost all regulatory bodies share is the idea of transparency. What data are you collecting? Why are you collecting it? Okay, and you need to inform the subjects of, again, what you're doing, why you're doing it. As a subset of that, you cannot just, under most regulatory bodies, you cannot just collect information and store it. You have to have a business need. Okay, so if I'm just out collecting information and our data and storing it, and there's no particular specific business need, then I would be violating some key principles of most of those regulatory bodies. The other key principle, and again, each one of these we could spend an hour on, but I'm just giving very high level. The other key concept is you need to ensure that you are putting in a reasonable effort to protect your data and your IT infrastructure from being compromised. So that could be a preemptive pen test or penetration testing. That could be having an internal assessment, external assessment, etc. Again, that's a whole nother discussion, but you do need to ensure that you're taking steps to protect your infrastructure. And then if there's a breach, if your customer's data is compromised, you need to report to the appropriate authorities and to your customers, to your shareholders, your stakeholders, your internal stakeholders. And for each regulatory body, those requirements are different. But for example, regulatory body A may say you have to report within 30 days. Others might be 14 days. Some are 60 days. But if you skip that, in most cases, you can be subject to fines. Cathay Pacific, they tried to cover up a data breach of over 1 million customer records. They sat on the information for almost a year. But when the authorities found out, actually some of the people faced criminal prosecution and the company faced some very serious fines. So just hiding that stuff away is not an alternative. You do also need, I would advise you to have a process in place. If there's a breach, who do we inform? How do we inform them? What's the plan? So you can just take the playbook off the shelf and go with that, okay? Let's go here. Additional strategies. Do a gap analysis between what regulatory body that you want to kind of follow or adhere to or kind of build your posture towards, and figure out where you're at right now and what you need to do to close that gap. Because 99.9% of the companies in the world, organizations in the world, are not fully compliant because it's impossible. It's very difficult to always be fully compliant. But the important thing is you understand where you're at, where you want to be, and you have that gap analysis. And then you have a plan on how to get from here to there. If you have that, and there is an issue, the regulatory bodies, in most cases, will look more favorably on your situation because you've demonstrated that, hey, when you're aware, you understood what the issues were, and you have a plan in place to address those issues. If you just say, we haven't looked at it, we didn't know, that's not going to sit well with most regulatory bodies. Okay. Again, you should have a response plan. If there's an issue, what do you do and who do you reach out to? Okay. Key thing, number 3, is training. Training for who? You need different types of training for different people in your organization. Obviously, if you're a CISO, a Chief Information Security Officer, a DPO, Data Protection Officer, etc., you're going to have more technical and probably a lot deeper training. But everybody in your organization should be aware of the importance of data protection and privacy and what are some of those general principles, and they should be trained on it. One of the like phishing emails. People know that some emails are suspicious, but not everybody knows how to react to it. I just heard a recent story, and it still happens. You get a new hire, they get an email from the CEO. They think it's the CEO, but it's a spoofed email. Looks like it's from the CEO. Says, "Hey, Mark, I need you to run out and do me, go get some gift cards." And I'm new. I'm like, "Oh, I got a message from the CEO." Boom, go get it. Give them the code, and the money disappears. That's bad, but what even worse is I click on a file that has some malware in it, and all of a sudden now my device and possibly our infrastructure is compromised. These things, all it is basically creating awareness, and there are companies out there that that have tools that will help you train your people in a kind of a fun, entertaining, and educational manner. Okay, I'll get into that a little bit later. Another important concept is, if you are a small, medium-sized business, or even if you're a large enterprise, you can't reinvent the wheel and do everything on your own. What you can do is you can outsource a lot of your compliance, data protection, and data security to cloud providers such as Google, AWS, and Microsoft. At memoQ, we use Microsoft Azure. The advantage of that is Microsoft spends hundreds of millions of dollars a year to protect their infrastructure. They have geolocation. So if there are requirements like the Canadian government doesn't want us to host data outside of Canada, guess what? We can comply because Azure they can meet that requirement. So don't try to kind of do it all yourself. It's hard. You don't have the deep pockets and the resources that those three big cloud providers do. Okay. They also map their compliance posture to all the leading regulatory bodies. And if you, for example, with Microsoft, you say, we need to be HIPAA compliant, we need to be there, they will give you the tools and the statement so that you can show that at least for that portion of your work, you're in compliance. Hey, Marcus, how am I doing for time? Where are we at here?
You're doing super at the time.
Okay. So shared responsibility. Yeah. Again, everybody in the organization needs to be aware, and they need to know that it's not just the CISO's job or the DPOs, or the IT guys, they take care of security. No, everybody who has a device, everybody has their computer, everybody who's sending company information needs to understand what are the basic rules of protecting that information and data. So again, it's that education piece. Okay. Just a couple more on best practices here. Mapping. You need to know what data you have. And it's interesting. You talk to a lot of organizations. You say, where's your data map? And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, you need to have a map that shows what data you have, where it's at. And it's really important because data that is not being used. And again, remember I said in order to have personal data, you typically need to have a business case for having it. If you don't have a business case for having it, basically it turns into a liability, because if that data is leaked or compromised somehow, now you've got those operational, reputational, and legal and compliance risks that you have to face. So Hiram at Adequest, he uses the example of, toxic chemicals in your garage. If you're not using those chemicals, you got to get rid of them. And data is the same way. It's a liability unless it has a specific need or purpose. So map that data out. Figure out if there's any data that you are not using and get rid of it in the responsible way. Data hosting restrictions. So it's interesting. At memoQ, for example, we can meet in the regulated industries. Some companies, they want to do an on-prem installation. We can manage that. Some want to use the cloud. So there's a multi-tenant cloud where you're sharing cloud space with other companies. Of course, your data is protected. But some companies want a private cloud tenant. And again, it could be with Azure, AWS, or Google. There are other options out there as well. But so it's important that for your industry, what are the restrictions? If you're dealing with a government, do they let you host that data outside of their country? If they do, what are their restrictions? I guarantee you there's restrictions. If it's finance, healthcare, or if you're working with any government authority, there will be some restrictions, and you need to know what they are. I actually jumped ahead. I talked about on-prem private cloud and multi-tenant cloud with regional options. But here's what Dieter says. He says, because we are a global company, we need to have instances around the world in order to maintain data sovereignty rights. A lot of requirements for web security are already well and truly covered by AWS. So again, it's not just me saying this. This is a guy who founded a company, and he's very, very much concerned about meeting their industry requirements. Okay, now I'm going to do kind of speed dating, speed presenting with some of the key tools that you should think about using. And if you're buying a technology, you're using a technology that you should kind of insist that it has. So 2FA is two-factor authentication, or also known as multi-factor authentication, which means it's not just a username and password. It could also be a text. It could be another email with a link on it. It's another way to authenticate. You need that. And by the way, I don't care what industry you're in, just as individual consumers, any of your accounts that has any information at all that you care about, I don't care what it is. It could be your Hotmail account, could be, but especially anything, financial related. Make sure you turn on your multi-factor authentication. It's the easiest, best, most secure way of protecting your information, whether you're a consumer or as an enterprise. SSO is single sign-on. So when you one of the most I guess the easiest vectors for those bad people out there to attack is passwords, because people are sloppy with their passwords, and they use passwords that are very easy to figure out. And I can show you a list of the 100 most commonly used passwords. And there are lists of the top 5,000 passwords. And they run it through an automated system, and they can figure out your username, first name, last name, @companyname.com, or whatever the convention is. And then they run through these random passwords, and your account's hacked. By eliminating the need to sign into multiple different platforms and tools and having a single sign-on, it's easier to maintain your password hygiene, okay? And come up with a password that's more effective. And also you can turn on that MFA as needed, okay? Increasingly, a lot of apps and tools are going passwordless. So that could be used like a biometric system. It can use where it looks at your eye, your finger. When I use my MacBook here, I can simply use my finger and we're good to go. There's even behavioral tools that will match how you type, and it will recognize, hey, you know what? This is Mark. Oh, this person is way, way, way quicker. It's definitely not Mark. Okay. So I think that's passwordless is something that you can look at, because it's much easier to maintain than trying to come up with a creative password every 3 months or whatever your requirement is. Patch hygiene. Any app out there any tool that you're using, you need to make sure that it's updated or that they provide regular updates. So if you're buying, I'm going to use a TMS example, make sure that you can use some of these tools like single sign-on. Make sure that they have good patch hygiene. Anomaly detection is simply a tool that says, it's kind of weird, Mark has never downloaded financial records before, and now he's downloading all of them. That's a flag. Another flag would be like impossible travel. It says Mark's logged in San Diego, but it also just said he logged in from Eastern Europe or Asia. That's not possible. So one of these is probably a bad actor. You should enable advanced threat protection, DLP, data loss prevention, and encryption. These are all tools. By the way, I'm sure that almost everybody on here is using Microsoft 365, Office 365. Those tools are there in Microsoft 365, and they're free. And what it will allow you to do, for example, you can set it up that if you're working on an Excel file, or you open an Excel file and it sees social security numbers, credit card numbers, it can identify different types of sensitive information. And then it will, depending on the policies that you've enabled, it will tag that data. And based upon the tag that related to that policy, it will force you to encrypt it. It will disallow you to send it out of the organization, or maybe allow you to send it out, but with a warning first. So there are all these tools, they're already there. One more thing I'm going to touch on, and then is just-in-time permission and lease permission. If you are a global admin, don't always be elevated your rights to global admin. Only elevate your rights when you need it. And anonymization and de-identification. If you're dealing with financial records or patient information, you can use these systems where you can still translate that information, but you need to make sure it's anonymized or de-identified. Anonymized means it's almost the same thing, but We can't see who these records are, but possibly later we could put the names back in. De-identification means it's irreversible. We will never be able to tie these records to a person. So encryption, anonymization, de-identification. Marcus, I see that
we have 5 minutes left, Mark. So
5 minutes.
Maybe we also want to ask you one. No, don't you have three other slides with the workflow?
3 slides. I'm gonna say something pretty simple. In our business, we work remotely a lot. You need to have a device management system, which would be a system that would allow your central admin to, if you lose your device is compromised, they can shut it down. They can control what you do with company data. So I have my own device here, but the company, when I'm dealing like company email, they actually have control of that part of how I'm using my device. So device management is important. Communication tools. We use Microsoft Teams because there's been, again, Microsoft invests hundreds of millions of dollars a year in security. There are other tools out there. As you know, some of them have had security issues. So use a tool that is secure, especially in the regulated space. Access rights. I'm going to focus on one part. Imagine in our industry, we work with a lot of external linguists. And if you send important data to an external linguist, you're kind of losing control. memoQ, for example, we have a tool that will disallow an external person from downloading the document, copying the document. There are workarounds. You know, I could take a picture with my cell phone, but you can disallow screenshots, for example, things like that. So make sure the tools or platforms you're using have a way to limit the access to data that you're sharing with people. Okay. Phew, I'm almost to the last slide.
That's what I meant.
Yeah. So I'm going to give you, when it comes to workflow automation, I'm going to give you 2 quotes here. The complexity of growing regulations, the growing volume, the amount of data that's coming out, driving change. Content is requiring customers to look at structured content and content management as a means to get a handle of all of it. And Regina Lin, that was from Barbara Peralta, who's Director of Life Sciences at Accolade, formerly for Amplexer. And then Regina Lin Preciado says at Content Rules, says structured content is turning content into a set of building blocks so that we can assemble and type information of the product we need. Last slide. So when it comes to automation, and again, I apologize because these topics, again, something we could spend days on. It's really important in life sciences and in financial services to create some structure in the content, so that you don't recreate the content and retranslate that content over and over again. There's obviously cost involved with doing that, with recreating it, but you also run issues in regulated industries of every time that you translate something, you run the risk of quality issues, right? And when you're talking about, you know, medical devices, pharma, even financial guidance, if you get it wrong, it's a liability. So if you can create content in a structured manner and reuse it, you reduce cost and eliminate risk. One of the best ways to do that is using the DATA architecture, which basically allows you to tag data and then be able to kind of seamlessly flow it into, whether it's being used in different PDFs, web pages, etc., immediately flow it into those places and update it kind of on the fly.
Sorry, Mark, I need to really time box it because we have to finish in time. It's just 2 minutes left.
2 minutes, and you need to run, right?
I need to run to introduce the next speaker. I'm sorry. I'm very
sorry.
Okay,
Marcus, thank you.
Would you allow me just one question? So what's from your point of view the most important first step when in cybersecurity and compliance? Just a short answer, if you like.
Awareness. Be aware of the risks and of what your plan is to move forward. That's it.
Thanks a million, Mark. It was
Thank you, Marcus.
Eye-opening session. Thanks, Mark. That concludes the session. We hope to see you in the next session with Camille Avila. I hope that people can contact you in the lounge, right? Thanks a lot, Mark. And have a good race, your mountain bike tour. Cheers. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.